This is a lecture on the domain object model for COMP 6291 web security. The purpose of this lecture is to teach you a little bit about DOM so you can use it in the area of web security. I'm not going to cover nearly enough that you can be a web designer and use the DOM to develop advanced web systems. The domain object model is a means of identifying the parts of a web page so that you can access them in a JavaScript program. Each piece of a web page is an object in the domain object model, and JavaScript can access that model. It can read the values on the screen. It can change them. You can add new elements. You can add new pieces to the screen. You can remove elements that are on the screen. You can change the style. You can change the color and font of a paragraph if you want. You can access each piece of the web page via the JavaScript program. Here's a really quick example that you'll see again. We have in the beginning a paragraph. The paragraph indicated by the bracket P and the NP, and here's its initial text, and it has an attribute ID. The ID is my ID. And then down in the JavaScript, we do a get element by ID looking for my ID. And then we change the HTML of that to change stuff. So while initially the web page would say initial text, after the script is executed, it will say change stuff. It will change what appears on the screen. The domain object model has many parts. It's a hierarchical structure of many nodes. The top of the thing is a document. That is your web page. And then there are many elements. If you've written any web pages, you know it starts with bracket HTML, and that's the root. And then you have the head and the body of the web page, and there's elements. Elements are paragraphs and attributes and all the pieces that make up your web page, each one of which can be identified in the JavaScript and modified if you need. As you might guess, the domain object model is object-oriented, and the document object is the owner and root of all the objects in the HTML page. There are multiple methods you can call on the document object to identify other objects in the document. One of the simplest actions a JavaScript program might take in a web page is to change or read the value of an element being a paragraph or a button or anything on the page. There is a property inner HTML of elements, and the inner HTML is the text of that element. So in this example, we have a paragraph starting with the bracket P and ending with the /P, and there's text that is regular. And it has the ID and ID, very original. And then down in the JavaScript, we first find that object. We do that by calling get element by ID on the document object, specifying the ID we want, and that returns our paragraph. And then we access the inner HTML property of that paragraph element, and we set it to a new value. In this case, I've set it to special. Notice I've also added some HTML tags to this. So previously we had just the word regular. The word special will be emphasized. EM is the emphasized tag, or bold. There are several ways to find a node or to identify a particular node that you want to access by a JavaScript program. One of them is get element by ID, which you can call on the document object. To do this, when you create the object in HTML, you specify an ID. In this example, the paragraph has the ID, the 1, along with some text here. So if you specify an ID, then later you can call document.getElementById, passing it the ID name, and that will find the ID that you're looking for. And in this case, it sets it to the variable myParagraph. So myParagraph has the node or the element that has the ID this. In other words, and the inner HTML of that paragraph would be original message. Down here, we set the inner HTML to something completely new. So now, instead of saying original message on the screen, it will say something completely new. Another way for a JavaScript program to access the elements on a web page is to use getElementsByTagName. That returns all the elements that have a particular tag, a tag being an HTML tag like bracket P for paragraph, bracket IMG for image, or bracket button for buttons. Now, many programs will have multiple items of this type. Most programs have lots of paragraphs. In this example, there are two paragraphs, bracket P, undergraduate, end paragraph, then bracket P, comp 621, end paragraph. So there are two paragraphs. So when we call getElementsByTagName, it's going to return a list of the elements. So in the example down here in the JavaScript, we call getElementsByTagName on the document object, passing a parameter of P. P is because we want a list of all the paragraphs. So now plist is a JavaScript list of all of the paragraph elements in the HTML page. And down here, because I access it like an array, so element 0, the .html of that, or the text of that one, is going to be set to the inner HTML of the second one, or element 1 in brackets. So while initially it says undergraduate comp 621, after the execution of the JavaScript, it'll just say comp 621 twice. JavaScript programs can also access elements of the page by looking for them by class name. In an HTML program, typically you would give a class to an item to identify that it's supposed to be rendered or shown on the screen in a way that's defined by the same CSS or cascading style sheet style. So all the elements with the same class will be displayed in the same color, same font, sort of stuff. Everything is defined by the CSS. So in this example, the paragraph has the class important. And then later on in the JavaScript, we will look for the document.getElementsByTagName, passing it the parameter important, and we'll get a list, if there's multiple ones, of the elements that have the class important. And then the next line, we change the style of that element. We say bracket 0, that identifies the first element in the list. .style, we're changing the style to display to none. Now, initially, the class was important, then it's changed to none. So assuming the style sheet had a specification for classes important and how important things should be displayed, now we've taken that off and it will no longer display according to that style sheet. It'll display in the normal format that Java normally does. A JavaScript program can change all the aspects of how an item in the page is displayed. For a given element, you can check the style dot whatever property, the style property you might want to change, color, font. In the example here, we have a paragraph which has the ID 1, and we print the normal stuff. And then later, we have a button that'll appear on the screen, and it gets a type button. And when you click on it, onClick specifies a JavaScript that will be executed when you click on the button. The button, by the way, says click me. And when you click on that button, the JavaScript that we're going to execute is very simple. It's one line. On the document object, it calls getElementById for ID 1, which is the ID of the one paragraph we show here. And we change the style.color to red. And so when you click on the button, the normal colored text here will become red. There are attributes of many different types that appear in HTML elements. You can change the attribute by just giving it the attribute name after identifying the element. In this example, we have an image, and it has the ID myImage, so we can identify it, and it has an SRC, or the source for this image is sad.gif. And then in the JavaScript, when this is executed, we call getElementById on the document object, specifying the ID. So we get that object, the image object. And then we want to change the src, that is the src attribute, which specifies what is supposed to be displayed. And so we're going to change that attribute to happy.jpg. And so now the image originally showed the sad GIF, we will now change the source of that image so it shows happy.jpg. So the sad picture will change to the happy picture. JavaScript programs can react to events that occur on the web page. There are all sorts of different events that might occur. In a previous example, we reacted to the click of a mouse. That's one type of event. You can react when a mouse just moves over an element, the element being either a button or a paragraph or an image. Whenever the mouse moves over that element, an event occurs, and the JavaScript program can execute a function to react to that event. There's an onload event that occurs when the page first starts. So when you first load the page in the browser, it calls on page. So this is JavaScript that will execute at the very beginning of your program. And of course, you can execute when it leaves at the very end. Sometimes you get those annoying pop-up boxes that say, do you really want to leave this page? Yes, I do. And those are signaled by the onLeave event. And of course, you can also specify an event. This is when an element is changed, you want to be notified. Now, a node is an element. There are more nodes in your document than just the elements because there are some internal nodes. But basically, everything you see is a node. The entire document is a node. So a document is of the node type. Every element is a node. Text inside the HTML are text nodes. And even the comments that appear in the HTML are comment nodes. You can navigate through them. There are a hierarchical ordering of the nodes, everything being rooted with the document and then the root element HTML and so forth. And you can navigate up and down the tree. The parent node is the previous node or the parent of this element. So you have multiple elements. It goes back up to the parent of this one. Child nodes is something the parent can go down there. Of course, there may be multiple child nodes, so you can have a list of child nodes and you can access them as you would an array, specifying the number of it. So the first one will be 0 and the next one 1 and so forth. First child is a shortcut to child node bracket 0. And last child is a shortcut to the last one, the size minus 1. Now an element may access the next element in the list. So an element can access its next sibling. That would be, if this is child node 5, the next sibling would be child node 6. And similarly, you can go back. You can go to the previous node. Oh, darn. The web system uses cookies to save information about a particular user. Cookies are sent from the server to the browser, and then the browser sends the cookie back to the server when it once again goes to that same website. The cookie is basically a string. There are many uses for the cookies. A big one is user identification. Say you log into a system. After you log in, the server sends a cookie back to the browser. And then when you access that website again, it knows that you are you because you have the right information in the cookie. The web servers are basically stateless, and they know who's coming in based on the cookie information from a previous visit. So you might identify, you might have passwords, or all sorts of information about what the user's been doing on your site. It can be saved in the cookie. Of course, as we know from using Zap, it is possible to change those cookies. You could also change the cookie in the JavaScript of that web page. The JavaScript can read the cookie. The cookie is represented as a string with all the information about all the cookies. You can read them, you can create them, you can delete them. You can do anything that you might do with a regular JavaScript object. And so as you store that, it stores it as a cookie, and that value will be returned to the website the next time you go to the website. Here's an example cookie. This is the HTTP headers returned from a server when I went out and did a get on a web page. As usual, the first line is the HTTP of the version, the 200 OK, the happy message saying the get worked correctly. And then there's a date and the content type, and then there's a set cookie. There were many other headers, but I cut them off. This is a long string that represents the cookie that the server returned back to my browser. The first part of it is a user ID, and then a long hexadecimal number used by the server to identify that it's me. A cookie can have an expiration date. In this one, you can see the expiration date for that cookie. If you don't specify an expiration date, the cookie will disappear when you close the browser. There's also a path that you can specify. The path indicates where this cookie should be stored in the client for this website. And this is the / is the root. That's very common. You'll see things stored in the root. There's also a domain parameter that specifies what domain. This will work for www.yumly.com or any other yumly.com website, and other parameters. So by looking at the javascript.cookie object, you can see all of these and change them as you need to.